There is a moment, early in any story worth telling, when nothing is yet named, when the shape of what's coming exists only as a feeling in the dark. I find myself thinking about this often. What did it feel like the first time someone sensed it? Not the force itself. The force was always there, woven through every living thing, every star, every grain of sand on every world the galaxy would one day remember to colonize. But the first time someone became aware that they were aware of it, that there was a consciousness in the vastness, and that consciousness could be touched, could be listened to. On a world whose name has been lost to the kind of time that swallows civilizations whole, a child stood alone in a garden at dusk. Around her grew plants that her people had learned to cultivate, food and medicine, and things that simply existed to be beautiful, and she stood among them with her hands open. What we know is this: she felt something move through her that was not breath, was not blood, was something older than her body and vaster than her mind. She did not have words for it, because her people had not yet made words for invisible things that bound visible things together. She simply knew, in the way a child knows danger or hunger or the presence of another person in a dark room, that everything around her was speaking, and that she could hear it. Somewhere else, and this matters, the everywhere else of it, on a world of crystal spires in a system that would eventually be mapped and catalogued and then forgotten again, a man lay fevered in a temple, dying of a sickness his healers could not name. His mind was slipping, the way minds do when the body begins its surrender, and in that slipping he found himself aware of threads. Not metaphors, I should say, or perhaps metaphors are the only language we have for what he experienced, which amounts to the same thing. He was aware of filaments of light connecting him to the people sitting vigil at his bedside, to the priests chanting in the chamber below, to the city beyond the temple, to the world itself, to something vast and patient that seemed to hold all of it in the gentleness of an infinite attention. He reached out, not with his hands, which no longer answered him, but with something beneath his hands, something his people would later call the inner sight, and he touched those threads. The fever broke. He lived another 40 years, and spent them trying to explain what he had felt. These stirrings, these first tremors of conscious communion with something larger than the self, they were happening everywhere, scattered across the stars like the first sparks of a fire not yet burning. On a moon orbiting a gas giant the color of rust, a scholar studying the movements of her worlds, three suns noticed something that shouldn't be possible. She could predict where they would be, not through mathematics, which she had tried and which never quite worked, but through a kind of knowing that arrived without being invited. The knowledge came as certainty, as a rightness that settled in her bones. Across the gulf of space, in the depths of an ocean world where strange beings moved in bioluminescent cities of coral and crystal, a musician discovered that his instrument responded to intention before it responded to touch. He thought a note, and it sang. He imagined a harmony, and his people gathered without knowing why they had gathered, their own voices joining in patterns so intricate and beautiful that some of them wept without understanding what they mourned. I don't think it's coincidence that these awakenings seem to happen in moments of extremity, loss, ecstasy, fever, the dissolution of the boundary between self and other. There's something in that. As if the force itself was most audible in those spaces where people became quietest, where the noise of the individual self grew thin enough to let something else through. What we must understand is that no one called it the force, not yet. Each culture, each world, each handful of people who experienced this inexplicable knowing, named it according to the shape it had worn in their lives. The energy of the eternal now. The breath of the star singers. The permission to live. The unbroken song. The light beneath the light. Some called it nothing, because it had no name that wouldn't break it into smaller pieces than it actually was. There were no Jedi yet to unify these experiences, to create a language that would let one world speak to another about what they had found. There were no orders, no councils, no temples with libraries that would one day hold millions of years of accumulated wisdom. There was only this: people, scattered across an almost incomprehensibly vast galaxy, discovering that consciousness was not private, that they were not separate, that everything was touching everything else in ways that operated beneath the scale of sight. And some of them, not all but some, began deliberately seeking this state, learning to quiet their minds so they could listen to it better, finding others like themselves and speaking about what they had felt. Very quietly, as if the universe were a sleeping thing that might wake up angry if they spoke too loud. These were the first stirrings. Not yet an order, not yet a philosophy, not yet a conflict between those who chose light and those who chose shadow. Only the first recognition that the darkness was not empty, that it was full of presence, and that human consciousness was vast enough to touch it. I think about what it cost them, these early ones, to speak the unspeakable, to reach for something their cultures had no framework for, to be the first to say, "I know something, and you should know it too, and we are not mad for knowing it." They had no guarantee that the awareness would persist, no assurance that their children would inherit the sensitivity, no way of knowing that what they had stumbled upon would eventually become the foundation for an order that would shape galactic history for tens of thousands of years. They only knew that they had touched something real, something vast, something that mattered, and that when you have touched a thing like that, you cannot pretend you did not. That recognition, that refusal to unsee what you have seen, that insistence on speaking what you have felt, that is where the story begins. Not with the Jedi, not yet, but with the quiet revolution of ordinary people discovering that they were not alone, and that the vastness they were touching was not hostile, but present and listening and waiting. They came into their gifts quietly, across 1,000 worlds the galaxy had never heard of, and they came alone. On a water-covered moon orbiting a gas giant in the outer rim, a woman named Calix was meditating in a cave when she suddenly became aware of every fish in the ocean around her, not their location, but their presence, their hunger, their contentment, a texture of consciousness she had no word for. She gasped, and the awareness vanished, leaving her breathless on the stone floor, convinced she had glimpsed something sacred and equally certain that no one she knew would believe her. In a desert city on a desert world, a merchant's son found that he could sense when someone was lying to him, not through any skill of reading faces, but through a kind of gentle wrongness that came to him when untruths were spoken in his presence. He thought he was becoming ill until the feeling saved his life. It warned him not to trust a guide who had seemed honorable, and later he learned that guide had planned to rob and murder his entire caravan. A child on a technologically advanced world, surrounded by thinking machines and endless noise, discovered she could hear silence instead, could feel the hum beneath things, a resonance that connected the stones of her city to the stars above it. Her parents brought her to physicians who found nothing wrong with her and suggested she was sensitive, artistic, prone to flights of imagination. But the child knew what she was sensing was real, and she began keeping a journal of the feeling, noting when it was strongest, when it was faintest, what seemed to call it forth or dampen it. These people, and there were more than they could have known, scattered across star systems so distant from one another that no vessel had ever traveled between them, were experiencing the same thing with different vocabulary. The Force, in those ancient times, was not yet called the Force. It had 10,000 names, or perhaps no names at all, only the wordless certainty that something bound them to the universe and the universe to them. There's something I find myself thinking about a lot when I consider this period, what it must have been like to have that experience, and to have no framework for it, no community, no confirmation that you were not simply mad. A scholar in a library on a high-gravity world began to notice that when he was deeply absorbed in learning, reading texts about mathematics, about the nature of light, about the architecture of living things, he could sense patterns that were not written on the page. He began to understand things before he had learned them, to know the solution to a problem before working through it, and he started writing down his insights in margins and personal journals. If others had read these journals, they might have called him a genius. But he knew it was something else. He was being shown, somehow, by something outside himself. A healer in a small settlement discovered she could sense where pain was in a body without examination, could feel the break in a bone or the inflammation in an organ through a kind of somatic awareness that moved through her like sight. She never told anyone because she was afraid of being accused of witchcraft, but she healed people others had given up on, and they called her blessed. The word felt inadequate for what she knew herself to be. Across those thousands of worlds, these awakening individuals began tentatively, carefully, to seek each other out. Some found their kind by accident, a traveler who recognized the expression in another's eyes, a peculiar quality of attention that suggested they were seeing something others could not. Some simply knew where to look, drawn by an instinct they could not explain, traveling to specific places because the force seemed to suggest they go. When two force sensitives met for the first time, the recognition was often instantaneous and often deeply emotional. They would speak haltingly at first, testing the waters with metaphor and careful phrasing, and then the words would pour out. I thought I was the only one. I thought I was broken. I thought I was going mad. You feel it too. A merchant's daughter and a scholar from opposite sides of their world traveled to a neutral point and talked for 3 days without sleeping, describing to each other the sensation of the energy that moved through all living things. By the end of those conversations, they had begun to sense each other's presence across the room, not through sight or sound, but through something that had no name in their language. They called it the touch, or the brightness, or the feeling when you are not alone. In those early encounters, there was no hierarchy, no teaching, no formal structure. There was only recognition and the profound relief of finding another person who experienced the world as you did. Some of these early communities began to form spontaneously, small groups of force sensitives gathering on worlds they felt drawn to, building settlements or monasteries or libraries where they could live near each other and practice whatever disciplines emerged naturally from their individual gifts. A water world became a place where those sensitive to life force congregated. A high-altitude city attracted those who felt most connected to the energy in space itself, the vast emptiness above the clouds. Some communities practiced meditation, others movement, others the deliberate study of texts trying to articulate what could barely be articulated. What strikes me about this era is the absence of certainty, which is strange to contemplate in hindsight. We know how the story turns out: the order, the council, the crystallized doctrine of light and dark, centuries of philosophy refined into teachable principles. But these first communities had none of that. They were explorers in their own consciousness, mapping a territory that had no maps, speaking a language they were inventing as they went. Some communities would eventually fail, their members scattering or their practices leading nowhere. Some would eventually give rise to traditions that would echo through millennia. But in this moment, this vast, patient stretch of 22,000 years before the founding of the Order, what mattered was the simple fact of communion. These force sensitives were discovering that consciousness reached beyond the boundary of the self, that the universe was not dead matter, but alive with a presence that could be felt, that could be touched, that wanted to be touched. They had felt isolated their whole lives because they experienced a connection to everything. Now they had found each other. And the fact of their meeting, their recognition of one another, their insistence that this was real and worth speaking about and worth organizing their lives around, that was the first true step towards something that would eventually become an order. There is a period in galactic history, long after those first seers had found one another, but long before the order you know anything about, that I find myself thinking about quite often, because it is a period of extraordinary fragmentation. a time when the Force-sensitive peoples of 1,000 worlds were speaking in 1,000 different languages about the same invisible truth. On the world they call Tithon, in a system where the stars seem to sing if you listened with something deeper than your ears, a community of Force users had gathered around a figure whose name translates roughly as the Keeper of Echoes, a woman who taught that the Force was fundamentally about listening, about making yourself quiet enough to hear what the universe was trying to tell you. Her students would sit in silence for hours, sometimes days, learning to still their minds the way a still pool reflects the sky without distortion, learning that the greatest force work was often the most invisible, the healing of a wound without touching it, the calming of a troubled heart across a crowded room, the simple act of being present enough that others felt less alone. Meanwhile, on an ice-locked moon circling a gas giant in the outer reaches, a different tradition had taken root entirely, one that understood the Force as something to be shaped and directed, almost like a craftsperson shapes clay or a musician shapes sound. There, a master called the Shaper of Winds taught that communion with the Force was only the beginning, that the real work was learning to move through it with intention, to feel not just the connection between all things, but to understand the geometry of that connection, the patterns that underlay reality. His students learned to influence weather, to guide the trajectories of objects through space, to sense the weaknesses in a structure, and know exactly where to place a hand to support it or a touch to help it fall. Neither tradition saw itself as incomplete or wrong. Each believed it had grasped something essential, and each was right in its own way. Elsewhere, on a world of vast libraries, where the heat of the day made travel impossible, and most life was nocturnal, a community of scholars had begun to systematize what they were learning, recording the testimonies of Force users from 100 different worlds, trying to find the common threads beneath the different vocabularies. One of these scholars, a patient woman named, the name doesn't translate, but it meant something like, she who reads the silence, began to notice something that troubled her deeply, that wherever Force users gathered in sufficient numbers and lived in proximity long enough, they began to fracture, to organize into schools of thought, each one convinced that their understanding was the deepest or truest or most practical. I think she was witnessing something inevitable, something that would shape the entire future of the Force-sensitive peoples, though she could not have known it at the time. Because the Force itself seemed to contain contradictions, or at least to present itself differently depending on who was perceiving it and what they brought to that perception. Some who touched it found gentleness, others found power. Some found knowledge, others found healing. Some experienced it as something sacred and reverent, others as something wild and exhilarating to be mastered. Each interpretation was valid, and each interpretation, when held too tightly, began to exclude others. There were worlds where Force users developed codes of conduct so strict that to break even the smallest rule was to be cast out. And there were worlds where anything done in the name of the Force seemed permissible because the Force itself was understood as beyond morality, as a force of nature like wind or gravity, indifferent to whether it built or destroyed. There were communities that forbade the use of the Force in any way that might harm, that saw their gift as fundamentally a tool of service and healing. And there were others, more distant, more isolated, that began to explore the darker channels of the Force, not out of malice, I think, but out of intellectual curiosity, out of a desire to understand every facet of the thing they had awakened to. Some of these darker traditions spoke of power that could be seized, of domination as a legitimate expression of one's will, of strength as its own kind of truth. Others spoke of the beauty of intensity, of embracing passion rather than tempering it, of force used without hesitation as a reflection of one's true nature. The tragedy, if I can call it that, is that none of these communities yet knew that the others existed in any organized way, or if they did, they were too far separated by distance and time for the knowledge to matter. A healer on one world might spend their whole life believing they alone understood the Force as primarily an instrument of compassion, never knowing that 10,000 light years away, Others had come to exactly the same conclusion and built entire meditative practices around it. A master of power might believe himself the first and only person in the galaxy to have discovered that the Force could be bent to one's will, never suspecting that the same discovery had been made 1,000 times in 1,000 different places, each time by someone who believed themselves unique. What strikes me most about this age of wanderers is how lonely it must have been, in a strange way. How many Force-sensitive individuals throughout the galaxy must have felt profoundly isolated, even when surrounded by others like themselves, because they did not yet have a language large enough to hold the complexity of what they knew. They sensed the Force, they communed with it, they built philosophies around it and taught students and wrote down what they understood. But they were all ultimately working from fragments, each tradition a different facet of something too large to see whole. It was as if the galaxy were covered in travelers, each one looking at a different piece of an enormous statue in the dark, describing what they felt. Here, a hand. There, a foot. Elsewhere, a curve of robe or the edge of a wing, and none of them able to step back far enough to see what they were all touching. There is something poignant in that, I think. Something about the human condition, or whatever the equivalent condition is for all the 1,000 kinds of beings scattered across the stars, that we are often most alone in our gifts, most isolated in our understanding, even when others are searching for the exact same truths we are. The age of wanderers would not last forever. Eventually, the distances would shrink, the technologies of communication would improve, and travelers would bring word from one corner of the galaxy to another that yes, there were others, there were many others, and they were asking the same questions. But in this time, 18,000 years before the Order would come together and attempt to answer those questions collectively, these Force users walked their separate paths, each one certain they were following the only truth, each one more right than they knew, and each one more incomplete than they realized. And in their incompleteness, in their isolation, they were planting something that would only truly germinate when someone finally asked, "What if we stopped trying to be right and started trying to understand each other?" There is a question that has haunted the galaxy for as long as memory reaches. Who came before, and what did they know? Not the first Force-sensitive beings, those scattered seekers we spoke of, finding each other across impossible distances, learning languages for their communion as they went. Something older still, something that looked at the raw architecture of space itself and asked, what if we could build here? I find myself thinking about this a lot, because what they left behind shaped everything that came after, even when no one remembered who had done the shaping. In those days, and I mean truly ancient, so far back that the civilizations who discovered their work had already risen and fallen and turned to dust, there moved through the galaxy beings of such power that the distinction between their technology and their command of the Force had long ago ceased to mean anything. We call them the Celestials now, though that is not what they called themselves. That name is a kind of echo, a reverential whisper made by later peoples who found their work and tried to imagine who could have made it. The architects, some called them, the shapers. What we know of them comes mostly in pieces, in the physical monuments they left behind, in fragments of records kept by civilizations that had already begun to decline when the Celestials were at their height, in legends so old that they have passed beyond the point of being credible histories and entered instead the realm of deep myth. But the monuments are real. You can walk to them, you can touch them. There is, for instance, the fact of the Corellian system itself, 5 planets arranged in perfect orbits, a configuration so mathematically precise that the odds of it occurring naturally are so small that to speak of them is almost to mock the concept of probability. Someone arranged those worlds, not over millions of years of happenstance collision and gravitational dance, but deliberately, with intention, the way a musician might place 5 identical instruments in a perfect circle. There are the black holes of the Maw, a cluster near Kessel where space itself seems wounded, compressed in ways that should not be possible, as though someone had taken the raw material of the cosmos and folded it into a pattern according to specifications we cannot fathom. And there is Centerpoint Station, a structure so vast that calling it a station seems almost absurd, a built thing of such scale that entire civilizations could live inside it and never touch the walls. These are not mysteries to be solved, they are facts to be contemplated. What drives me to speak of them now, in this part of our story, is not the structures themselves, but what they represent, the knowledge that lay beneath their creation. Because the Celestials did not build these things through machinery alone, or if they did, the machinery was itself an expression of something deeper, a mastery so complete over the fundamental forces that bind the universe that they could reshape the galaxy the way you, or I might reshape clay. Was this the force? Was this something else? The honest answer, I think, is that by the time they were doing this work, the question had become meaningless. They had walked so far into mastery that the boundary between channeling an energy and commanding it, between serving a cosmic principle and bending it to your will, had dissolved entirely. And here is the thing that matters for our story. They left knowledge behind. Not necessarily on purpose. Perhaps their civilization fell, or transformed, or moved beyond the need for the physical records they had kept. Perhaps they simply ceased to care about the galaxy they had shaped and turned their attention elsewhere. But what they left, texts, devices, concepts encoded into artifacts that later civilizations found and studied and tried to understand, became a kind of inheritance. Fragments of their learning scattered across the stars, waiting to be found. Some of that knowledge fell into the hands of the Killiks, insectal beings who served the Celestials in ages past, and who preserved certain teachings in their own way, encoded in the very structure of their collective minds. Some was discovered by the Sharu, who built great civilizations on the strength of it, who understood things about the manipulation of matter and probability that seemed almost like sorcery to other peoples. Some simply waited in vaults and libraries on dead worlds, patient and inexplicable, for whoever came next to wonder what it meant. And I think, though this is speculation, and I hold it lightly, that some of what they left behind was knowledge of the Force itself. Not the scattered, intuitive sensing that the early Force users possessed, but systematic, codified understanding. Methods, philosophies, perhaps even warnings. The Celestials, you see, had already walked both paths. They had mastered what we might call the light, the expansion of consciousness, the communion with the living galaxy, the ability to sense the deepest threads of connection between all things. But they had also walked the dark, the domination of matter and will, the assertion of individual power over the resistance of the universe, the transformation of that binding energy into a tool of control. And they had discovered, I think, what every civilization that truly masters power eventually discovers, that both paths are available and that the choice between them is the only meaningful choice there is. In this moment, though, 15,000 years before the Jedi Order would even be imagined, the Force-sensitive communities scattered across the galaxy were still in their innocence. They did not yet know about the Celestials, or only in the vaguest way, as mythic figures from an incomprehensibly distant past. The healers on Tithon, the shapers on their isolated worlds, the scholars in their great libraries, they were still discovering their gifts, still learning to listen, still convinced that their work was new. They did not understand that they were rewalking a path that others had already traveled to its end. They did not know that the galaxy contained blueprints for both transcendence and annihilation, written in the language of the Force, waiting to be read. But the knowledge was there, scattered, hidden, partially forgotten, but there. Like seeds planted by a gardener who had long ago walked away, waiting for the right conditions to grow. And the stories, the legends and whispers and fragments of records that had survived the ages, they were the map. Later generations would find these pieces. They would study them. Some would understand them correctly, and some would misunderstand them in ways that would change the course of galactic history. But that is a chapter ahead of us yet. For now, I want you to sit with the image of it, a galaxy that had been shaped by masters, bearing their fingerprints, still resonating with echoes of their knowledge. An inheritance left behind, patiently waiting. And a new generation of seekers, not yet knowing they were heirs to something vast, learning to hear the voice of the Force for the first time. There is something almost tender in that moment of unknowing, before the weight of history falls, before they understand the stakes. Let us dwell there, in that quiet time, before we move forward. You know, there's a question that haunts anyone who looks back on this period. When does a philosophy become a tyranny? When does the pursuit of power become indistinguishable from the thing itself? Because among all the scattered Force users across the galaxy, the healers and listeners and humble seekers we spoke of before, there were always some who heard the Force differently. Not as a voice inviting communion, but as something to be mastered, commanded, bent entirely to the will of the one strong enough to seize it. These were not mad people, understand that first. They were often brilliant, disciplined, and had understood something real about the Force that the light-sided traditions sometimes preferred not to speak of, that it could be used to compel, to dominate, to remake reality according to a singular vision. And for a long time, these darker practitioners were scattered too, isolated by their own hunger, sometimes working at cross purposes, their power diluted by infighting and ego. That changed when certain dark side adepts, exiled from the communities of light, driven out for transgression, or simply choosing their own path, arrived on a world called Korriban. I think sometimes about what they must have felt, those first dark Jedi, when they encountered the native Sith species there. Not the twisted servants they would later become, but a people with their own traditions, their own relationship to the Force, living in a culture already steeped in power and dominion. Here was not a blank slate to conquer, but a civilization that could be awakened to possibilities it perhaps had only half dreamed. The merger was not sudden. It was a seduction, really, a slow cultivation of understanding between two groups who recognized in each other a kindred hunger. The dark side Force users taught the Sith that power need not be constrained by philosophy, that fear was a more reliable foundation than compassion, that the universe rewarded those willing to take what they wanted. And the Sith, in turn, provided something the exiles had lacked, a civilization willing to organize itself entirely around their vision, to build institutions and armies and monuments in service to that vision. Within generations, and I find myself thinking about this often, about how quickly such things can happen, a true empire began to take shape. Where the scattered Force users of the light had built small temples and academies devoted to understanding, the Sith constructed fortresses. Where the light side traditions asked their students to question and debate and seek truth, the Sith demanded obedience. The Valley of the Dark Lords rose on Korriban, and into it were placed the tombs of the great Sith Lords, each one a monument to a life spent pursuing absolute power, each death a transition of dominion to whoever possessed the strength to claim it. The tombs were not just burial sites, understand. They were repositories of knowledge, vaults where Sith alchemy and dark side ritual had been woven into the very stone, where a student could commune with the echoes of their predecessors' mastery and hunger. It was breathtaking in its way and terrifying, because the Sith had grasped something crucial. If you wanted to build something that would last, you had to make power itself sacred, had to weave it into the foundations so that every person who came after would be shaped by it. This is where the Celestials' scattered knowledge, left dormant across the galaxy, found new hands to use it. The ancient beings had shown that the Force could be commanded at scales ordinary mortals could barely comprehend, and the Sith, patient, brutal, ingenious, began to recover those fragments, to study them, to build dark technologies that blurred the line between machinery and sorcery. The Empire grew outward from Korriban like a stain, conquering neighboring systems, consolidating power through a combination of military might and Force-fueled domination that no fragmented resistance could withstand. And here is what strikes me most as I sit with this history. The dark side philosophy in the hands of the Sith worked. It delivered tangible results in a way that made the light side traditions look naive. While the light side seekers were still debating the ethics of power, still seeking consensus among themselves, still trying to understand their gifts without using them to compel, the Sith had already subjugated 3 star systems and were building the machinery of lasting control. For a time, a long, dark, and consequential time, it seemed that perhaps the light side philosophers had been wrong all along, that the universe was indeed a place that rewarded ruthlessness and punished kindness. But there was a cost, one that the Sith's own structure would eventually make inevitable. A philosophy built entirely on domination and fear requires constant vigilance, constant expansion, because the moment an empire stops growing is the moment it begins to be consumed from within by everyone climbing over everyone else to reach the top. The Sith Lords ruled, yes, but they ruled over a civilization perpetually at war with itself, where betrayal was not a breach of trust, but the expected mechanism by which succession occurred. There's something to note here about the divergence that was now crystallizing across the galaxy. On one side, the light side seekers, scattered and uncertain, still developing philosophies of compassion and service, still debating fundamentals. On the other, the dark side Sith, unified under a hierarchy of power, assured in their vision, expanding their dominion system by system. It looked, in those centuries of the Sith Empire's ascendance, like the outcome was already written. It looked like darkness was simply more efficient than light. I think that's what makes what comes next so important to understand, not as a victory narrative, but as a moment when the light side traditions began to understand something essential about themselves. They had been scattered because they were devoted to understanding, to questioning, to allowing each seeker their own path. But that same quality, that commitment to individual insight and collective dialogue, would eventually become their strength. The Sith had unified through domination and found that domination was fragile. The light would eventually unify through shared principles and find that such unity was almost unbreakable. But that's a story for later chapters. For now, we sit with this. The Sith emperors had risen, proven that the Force could be weaponized at civilization scale, and inadvertently posed the question that would eventually force the scattered light side traditions to stop asking whether they should organize themselves and start asking how. I want to talk now about what happened when the light and dark finally met, not as ideas exchanged quietly in scattered communities, but as movements large enough to move armies, to reshape worlds, to demand that everyone choose a side. For a long time, centuries, perhaps millennia, the Force-sensitive peoples of the galaxy had developed in isolation, each tradition certain of its own understanding, each convinced it walked toward truth while others wandered in shadow or, worse, in dangerous ignorance. But isolation has a shelf life. As communities grew, as more children were born with the gift, as knowledge spread along trade routes and refugee paths, the impossible began to happen. The different traditions encountered each other. And when they did, something broke that had never been whole to begin with. I find myself returning to a question that haunts all of what comes next. Was the fracture inevitable, or did the Force itself have something to do with it? There are scholars who argue, and I think they may be right, that the Force is not neutral in the way we sometimes assume, that it has a nature, a kind of gravitational pull toward certain truths, and that when enough consciousness presses against it, seeking to understand it, the pressure itself creates opposing forces. Think of it this way. You cannot study the Force without being changed by it, and you cannot be changed by it without developing convictions about what it means. And once you have convictions, you have doctrine. And once you have doctrine, you have disagreement. The conflict that erupted, and I'll call it the Wars of Shadow and Flame, though history gave it many names across many worlds, was not a sudden explosion. but a slow recognition that the paths that had seemed to run parallel actually diverged, and diverged in fundamental ways. On some worlds, particularly those that had felt the reach of the dark side empire rising from Korriban, Force-sensitive communities who had once understood their gifts as extensions of compassion and communion began to arm themselves. They studied the old celestial knowledge with new urgency, not to understand it, but to match it, to build defenses, to create weapons that could protect against weapons. On other worlds, smaller groups of Force users who had been exiled for their ruthlessness, for their belief that power should be wielded without apology, for their conviction that the Force was a tool to be mastered rather than a presence to be served. These wanderers found in the rising Sith Empire a philosophy that validated everything they had been cast out for believing. They migrated toward the dark, and in doing so, they transformed it from a distant heresy into an immediate threat. The wars themselves, I want to be careful not to sensationalize this, but also not to diminish it, were extraordinarily brutal. Imagine a conflict where the combatants could perceive your intentions before you acted on them, could touch your mind without touching your body, could bend the very physical world to their will. There is no defense that armor provides against that. There is no strategy that maps cleanly when your enemy can see the shape of your thinking. What emerged instead was something closer to philosophical violence, communities trying to contain each other not just militarily, but ideologically, using the Force itself as both weapon and argument, trying to prove through dominance that their understanding of the Force was the true one. I think about the civilians caught in those conflicts, people who had not chosen sides, because the idea of sides had not yet solidified in their minds. They experienced the Force as the generations before them had, as a presence, as communion, as something that connected rather than divided. And then they were forced to watch as that same Force became a tool of separation, a way of marking people as enemies or allies, a justification for violence. Something was lost in that transition that the galaxy never quite recovered. On Tithon, where the tradition of the healers had been particularly strong, the libraries were burned by dark-side adepts seeking the celestial knowledge stored there. The healers, who had defined themselves through their refusal to kill, found themselves having to choose between their philosophy and their survival. Most chose survival, and in doing so, they changed irrevocably. On other worlds, light-side communities won their wars decisively, but the victory came at a cost. They had to become militarized, organized, hierarchical in ways that contradicted their earlier principles of distributed authority and individual seeking. There's a phrase that echoes through the accounts of this period, repeated across multiple worlds in different languages, but always meaning the same thing. The Force taught us how to hurt each other. I don't think this was the Force's intention, if the Force has intentions. But I think it reveals something true about the nature of consciousness itself. That awareness is never purely revelatory. It is also always a tool, and tools can be used for harm. What the wars of shadow and flame proved, definitively, was that the Force would not remain pristine and unified. It would not be a single truth that all seekers converged on peacefully. Instead, it would become a terrain of contested meaning, a landscape where light and dark were no longer abstract concepts, but embodied philosophies, defended militarily, taught religiously, and worth fighting for. By the time the conflicts began to settle, and they did settle, eventually, through exhaustion rather than resolution, the galaxy had learned a hard lesson, that the same gift that allowed communion also allowed domination, that the same consciousness that could sense connection could sense vulnerability and exploit it. What emerged from the wars of shadow and flame was not enlightenment, but clarification. The light-side traditions, scattered as they still were, began to understand that they would have to become more organized, more unified, more willing to set aside their individual seeking in order to survive as a movement. The dark side practitioners, for their part, found that their victories were never as complete as they seemed. That domination required constant vigilance. That power seized through fear was always vulnerable to the turning of a more ambitious student. And somewhere in the ashes of those conflicts, in the ruins of temples and the memories of the displaced, something very important took root. The understanding that the force, or at least the wielding of it, could be bound by principles. That one could study it, and practice it, and teach it within a framework that was explicitly committed to certain values over others. The light side adepts, bruised and transformed by war, began to ask themselves, what if we formalized our understanding? What if we created something larger than individual communities, something with shared doctrine and shared purpose? What if we stopped allowing darkness to define us reactively, and instead defined ourselves proactively, through commitment to principles we had thought through carefully? That question, born in the fires of the wars of shadow and flame, would eventually lead to everything that followed. There is a particular kind of silence that comes after a great collision, when the dust has settled, but nothing has been resolved, when both sides have bled and neither has won. This is the silence in which the Rakata found themselves, 8,000 years before the Jedi Order would be born, masters of a technology that had no equal, possessing a connection to the Force that burned in them like a second sun, and yet restless. I think about this often, the difference between being powerful and being satisfied. The Rakata had arrived in the known galaxy not as conquerors at first, but as refugees, fleeing some catastrophe in the depths of the unknown regions that the histories do not quite explain. They came from Lehon, a world that orbited in isolation, and when they emerged into the wider galaxy, they discovered something that must have felt like providence, that their mastery of the Force could be weaponized, that their intuitive understanding of energy and creation could be bent into tools of dominion. They were not the first dark side practitioners. The Sith Empire had already risen and was reaching the height of its terrible power. But the Rakata possessed something the Sith had not yet fully grasped, the ability to marry mysticism and machinery into a single, seamless instrument of control. Where the Sith commanded through fear and hierarchy, the Rakata commanded through infrastructure. They built technologies that obeyed only those who carried the Force within them, ships that answered to thought, weapons that required not strength of arm, but strength of will. They created the Star Forge, a structure so vast that calling it a station seems almost insulting. It was a factory, an engine, a hunger made manifest, drawing power from a star itself and producing war machines without end, each one hungry for the dark side energies that poured into it like blood. And they conquered. They moved outward from Lehon, with the methodical patience of beings who understood that they had discovered something approaching infinity. World after world fell into their grasp. Korriban, where the remnants of the Sith had built their own dark empire, submitted or was remade. Dantooine, with its forests and its secrets, became a place of chains. Kashyyyk, where the Wookiees fought with a ferocity that earned them a place of terrible honor in Rakatan history, as slaves so valuable they were worked until they broke, then worked longer. Tatooine, a desert world of no particular significance, except that the Rakata needed slaves, and had learned that any world could be rendered profitable if you were willing to take everything from it. They called it the Infinite Empire, and the name is worth considering carefully. Infinity is not truly a measurement. It is an admission of incomprehensibility. The Rakata chose that word because their empire had grown so vast, connected by hyperspace routes that only they fully understood, that the very notion of its boundaries had become theoretically absurd. Subjects, countless. Worlds under their dominion, incalculable. The expansion seemed to have no natural limit, no moment at which it would plateau and stabilize. Here is what I find myself thinking about. This is what happens when one group of beings possesses both the will to dominate and the technology to make that dominance absolute and scalable. The light side traditions scattered across the galaxy had spent millennia learning compassion, understanding interconnection, grappling with whether power should be used at all. The Rakata spent no time on such questions. They saw capacity, and they implemented it, like asking a river why it flows downhill. But there is something else embedded in this age that matters, something that comes through in the quiet testimony of the enslaved peoples who would eventually rebel, who would tell stories to their descendants about the infinite empire in tones of awed horror. The Rakata were not cruel for cruelty's sake, or rather, their cruelty was not personal. It was systemic, structural, the inevitable consequence of a civilization that saw everything outside itself as a resource to be extracted. The humans they enslaved, the Duros, the Zabrak, the countless species pressed into the machinery of conquest, they were not hated by their masters. They were simply not regarded as having any value except as components in a larger apparatus. To be enslaved by the Rakata was to be made into a tool, and tools do not receive cruelty. They receive maintenance, just enough to keep them functioning. And yet there was something in this very mechanization that contained the seeds of its own unraveling. When you reduce beings to functions, when you force them into roles defined entirely by your need, you create a situation where those beings have nothing left to lose by resistance. The slaves of the infinite empire could not appeal to their master's compassion. They would not have understood the word in that context, but they could conspire, organize, rebel. There is a particular kind of strength that comes from being valued at zero. It asks nothing, expects nothing, and has nowhere further down to fall. Also, and this is a detail that seems almost forgotten in the grand narratives of empires, the Rakata were not unified in their ambitions, not truly. They were a species bound together by shared power and shared dominance, which is not the same as shared purpose. As the centuries accumulated, as the apparatus of the infinite empire grew larger and more complex, disputes arose about how resources should be distributed, about which worlds should be prioritized for conquest, about the very nature of power itself. An empire with no internal principle beyond extraction tends toward fracture. The Sith had discovered this 3,000 years earlier. The Rakata would learn it in their turn, though not before they had reshaped the face of known space in ways that would echo across thousands of years of history yet to come. For now, 8,000 years before the Jedi Order's first breath, the infinite empire at its zenith seems almost immovable, a force as inevitable as gravity, as impersonal as mathematics, as absolute as death. But the galaxy is watching. The scattered light-side traditions, bloodied and sobered from their wars with the dark, are taking note of what Rakatan domination looks like at scale. The enslaved peoples are learning in whispers what organized resistance might require. The very stars seem to hold their breath, as if waiting for the moment when something that has conquered everything learns, finally, what it means to face an opponent that cannot be conquered because it has already lost everything worth losing. This is the nature of empires built on dominion alone. They are always, in the moment of their apparent greatest triumph, closer to collapse than they know. This is what the infinite empire does not yet understand about itself. There's a moment in the historical record, though I use the word moment loosely when speaking of epochs that span centuries, when something shifts in how the seers across the galaxy began to speak to one another. Not in their methods. They still used whispered words and long-distance communion through the Force, still carried messages on ships across the dark between stars. But in what they were saying, in what they had begun to see. On Tithon, where the traditions of healing and listening had grown deepest roots, an old seer named Kadash recorded something in the great archives that would echo forward for thousands of years, a vision of balance. Not balance as equilibrium, not the patient thought that light and dark must coexist in some cosmic stasis, but balance as healing, balance as something that could be brought. He described in his own careful language the image of a figure, not a person precisely, but a presence, a convergence, who would come when the force itself grew too fractured, too wounded by its own internal war. And something in his description resonated. Across the scattered communities, other seers began to speak of parallel visions. On a moon circling a nameless world in the outer rim, a listener named Tita woke one night with the exact same knowing Kadash had recorded, though she had never read his words. On Ossus, in a library where knowledge was collected and compared, a scholar named Verin found fragments of prophecy from 3 different sources, each describing the same arrival, the same moment of transformation. These were not messages passed between worlds. These were independent seeings, spontaneous prophetic knowing arising in isolation, yet converging on a singular truth. I find myself thinking about what that means, actually. When a vision arises unbidden in multiple unconnected minds across a galaxy of billions, you cannot dismiss it as rumor or mistake. It becomes something more difficult to explain away. It becomes data. The seers understood they were witnessing something real, something the Force itself was broadcasting across the channels of consciousness they had learned to listen through. The prophecies began to be recorded more carefully after that. Not as the ramblings of mystics, but as testimony, compared and cross-referenced, and analyzed the way a scholar might approach any phenomenon worth understanding. What emerged from this careful work was something unexpected. The descriptions were strangely consistent across vastly different cultures and Force traditions. A bringer of balance, a convergence of light and dark within a single consciousness, a figure who would arrive at a moment of ultimate fracture and healing. But also, and this was what made the prophecies so troubling to those who studied them, a figure born into suffering, shaped by it, capable of choosing to redeem it or to be destroyed by it. The prophecies were not descriptions of a savior arriving from without to impose order. They were prophecies of a catalyst, someone who would be as much a choice as a destiny. There is something in that distinction that seems to me to matter. A savior imposed is tyranny dressed in other clothing, but a catalyst, someone whose own struggle contains the possibility of transformation, that is something different. That is someone whose decision to heal, rather than to fracture, becomes the thing that heals. What the seers did not yet understand, what they could not have understood, is that they were not simply recording a prophecy. They were creating the expectation that would eventually manifest it. By speaking of balance, by teaching it, by making it the thing that young, Force-sensitive students across the galaxy would eventually be trained to serve. They were writing a story into the fabric of future history, simply by insisting it was worth telling. The Sith on Korriban, who had spent generations consolidating power through domination and fear, remained unmoved by these prophecies. Power in their philosophy was not something to be balanced against, but to be hoarded, deepened, weaponized. Yet even they heard the whispers. Even they understood, in some intuitive way, that something in the structure of the Force itself seemed to be turning. The light side traditions, meanwhile, seized upon the prophecies with something approaching gratitude. For years they had been fragmented, uncertain whether their commitment to service and compassion could ever match the focused violence of the dark. Now they had something else, the knowledge that the Force itself seemed to be driving toward balance. Not because they were stronger, but because balance was the deeper truth. Prophecy, in this way, became a gift that the future gave to the present. It gave those who were losing their wars a reason to persist. It told them that their principles were not merely idealistic gestures, but attunement to something real, something written into the nature of existence itself. The seers who recorded these visions became something new in the galactic communities. They became teachers who pointed toward a future none of them would live to see. Kadash on Tithon, Teet on her moon, Verin in the archives. They devoted the remainder of their lives not to personal mastery or even to immediate power, but to recording, comparing, and teaching what they had seen. They created schools, They began to establish the practice of what we might call prophetic literacy, the ability to listen to visions not as private mystical experiences, but as collective knowledge worth preserving. This was the beginning of institutional memory about the nature of the Force. This was the moment when scattered seers began to imagine themselves as part of something larger than their own lineages. It would take another 5,000 years before the formal Jedi Order crystallized from this longing. It would take another 1,000 before the Council was established and the prophecies were formally enshrined in the teachings. But the seed was planted here, in these moments when independent minds across the galaxy began to speak of a future they did not yet know how to build. I think that's what prophecy really is, when you strip away the mysticism. It's not prediction. It's not destiny delivered from outside time. It's the Force, the deep, patient truth running through all things, speaking to those who listen about what is already becoming. And then those listeners choosing, by hearing it and believing it and teaching it forward, to become the people who make it true. The prophecies of balance did not predict the Jedi Order. They called it into being. They were the words that convinced scattered seers that their scattered work was not futile. That light itself might have the power to organize, to grow, to become something that could stand against the dark without becoming the dark itself. And in those visions, in the images of convergence and healing, and a figure born to choose redemption, the future was already singing. The infinite empire did not collapse all at once, which in some ways made it worse. There was time to watch it happen, time to understand what was occurring, no merciful suddenness to grant the illusion that it might have been inevitable all along. You know, there's a moment in any long story when isolated voices begin to call out across the darkness, hoping to hear an echo that answers back. It happened slowly at first, a scholar on Ossus receiving a letter from someone she'd never met, describing an experience so close to her own that her hands trembled reading it. A healer in the outer reaches encountering a wandering philosopher at a spaceport and recognizing, in the quality of their presence, a kinship that needed no introduction. These meetings were not accidental, though they appeared to be. They were the result of something deeper, a kind of gravitational pull that brought people together who had spent lifetimes believing they were singular in their experience. By the time we reached 3,500 years before the Jedi Order was formally established, something crucial had shifted in the galaxy's consciousness. It was no longer enough to practice the Force in isolation, to maintain small communities of practitioners on distant worlds, each convinced they held a private piece of a truth too large to share. The collapse of the Rakatan Infinite Empire had scattered something more than just technology across the stars. It had scattered possibility. When slavery ended and conquered worlds found themselves suddenly untethered from the machinery of domination, those who had learned to sense the Force began asking a question they hadn't dared to ask before. What if we were not alone? What if, across the galaxy, others like us had been quietly practicing, quietly developing, quietly arriving at conclusions we had believed were uniquely our own? The answer came not as revelation, but as hunger, a genuine, intellectual hunger to know what others had learned, how they understood things differently, where their certainties diverged from certainty itself. Philosophers and Force users began, quite intentionally now, to seek each other out. It was not easy. The galaxy was vast. Communication was uncertain. Trust between strangers was always provisional. But there was an advantage. Those who could touch the Force often sensed when another Force-sensitive was near, a kind of recognition that moved below language, below introduction. On Ossus, in great libraries where scholars had been documenting their observations for centuries, the first gathering began to take shape. Teachers arrived from Tithon, carrying records of their own traditions, their own ways of understanding the relationship between the self and the infinite. Visitors came from smaller communities across the Outer Rim, many of them having traveled for months or years, following nothing but an inner compass that told them, "Go here, others will be waiting. I find myself thinking about what those first conversations must have felt like, the simultaneous relief and disorientation of discovering that what you had believed was unique to your world was actually a pattern repeating across impossibly distant worlds. One person might describe how they had learned to heal through compassionate attention. Another would recognize the same principle, though they had called it something different in their language, and had applied it to architecture, to cultivating gardens, to the patient work of understanding mechanical systems. The Tithon monks, who had emerged from centuries of internal conflict between the traditions of the Ashlar and the Bogan, arrived already understanding that the Force could be perceived as both light and dark, and that the real work lay in understanding what that distinction actually meant. Were light and dark objective features of the Force itself, or were they categories imposed by the observer's intention? Some argued passionately that darkness was a disease, a distortion, something that could and should be purged from any serious practitioner. Others, more cautious and more historically scarred, suggested that darkness was part of the Force's nature, that the attempt to eliminate it entirely was both futile and possibly dangerous, that the real mastery lay in understanding it, in choosing not to be consumed by it. These were not arguments that resolved neatly, and that was the point. What made these gatherings transformative was not that they produced agreement, but that they produced something rarer, a commitment to debate in good faith, to share knowledge even when that knowledge contradicted your own understanding, to treat the stranger's experience as potentially equal in validity to your own. There was a scholar. I wish I could tell you her name with certainty, but the records are scattered and time has been unkind to proper attribution, who began the first systematic collection of what different force-using traditions called their philosophy. In one region, practitioners spoke of service to the community, in another of unity with all living things, in yet another of the pursuit of wisdom for its own sake, and in places touched by darker traditions of power as the ultimate good, of the self as the only reliable measure of value. Rather than dismissing any of these as simply wrong, she began to look for the structure underneath them, the common patterns that united even those who reached opposite conclusions. There was something profound in that move, the recognition that how someone interpreted the Force said something true about them, about their culture, about what they had learned and survived. And that all of these interpretations, taken together, might constitute something larger than any single tradition had achieved in isolation. The debates were intense and sometimes angry. There were moments when the gathering seemed on the verge of fracturing into open conflict, philosophy becoming justification for the old wars that the Rakatan collapse had only temporarily paused. But something held, a shared sense perhaps, that the collapse of the last great dark empire meant something, that it was not accidental, that it had to mean something. If domination ultimately destroyed itself, then mastery could not be built on the model of domination. If the only stable empires seemed to be the ones built on scattered, federated communities sharing principles, rather than a central authority imposing them, then perhaps the Force users who hoped to endure needed to discover how to be strong without being unified in the traditional sense. This was the seed of what would later become the Jedi Order's distributed council structure, though no one in the room knew that yet. They were simply trying to learn from each other, to ask questions without knowing if answers were possible, to treat the stranger's way of seeing as valuable, even when it troubled your own certainty. There's something quietly radical in that, in choosing to remain uncertain together rather than certain alone. And as the gatherings became more regular, as routes between Ossus and Tithon and a dozen other centers became worn by the footsteps of pilgrims and teachers and curious minds, something began to crystallize. Not a unified doctrine yet, that would come later, but a shared language, a common set of concerns, a commitment to the proposition that Force users needed each other, needed to learn from each other, and that the work of understanding the Force was too large for any single person or tradition to complete in isolation. The galaxy was still fractured, still recovering from the weight of the infinite empire's collapse. But in the spaces between the scattered worlds, minds were gathering, and with them came the possibility of something new, something that had never existed before. A true communion of seekers, all walking toward truths they did not yet have names for, trusting that the walking itself mattered more than arriving. That's where we pause, in that moment of opening, when the conversations have only just begun, and everything that grows from them is still waiting to be discovered. After the Rakata fell, after their machines went silent, and their enslaved worlds rose up, and their great star forge dimmed into cold metal, something remarkable happened in the quiet that followed. The scattered force-using communities of the galaxy realized they were no longer alone in isolation. On Ossus, where libraries had been painstakingly rebuilt by patient hands after the Rakatan occupation, a scholar named Verin looked at the gathering philosophers around her long table and asked a question that had no easy answer. What do we actually agree upon? The question itself was radical, because for thousands of years the answer had been almost nothing. The healers from the outer worlds believed compassion was the deepest channel to the Force. The architects who shaped matter and energy believed understanding was the path. The warrior mystics who had defended settlements believed that service required the capacity to defend what mattered. The ascetics in their temples believed that emptying the self was the only way to hear the Force clearly. Each tradition had watched the others with something between curiosity and suspicion, certain that their own path held the essential truth and the others had grasped only fragments. Verin, I think, and there's no certainty here, because the records thin out, had lived long enough to study all of these traditions intimately, and she had come to a humbling realization. They were all describing the same thing from different angles, the way a musician and a mathematician and a painter might all be responding to something true about the world that none of them could encompass alone. What if, she asked them, instead of arguing about which tradition was correct, we asked, what must be true about the Force itself if all of these contradictory experiences are genuine? The answer, they came to understand, was both simple and transformative. The Force was too vast to be mastered by any single philosophy, too nuanced to be captured in doctrine, too alive to be reduced to rules. But the principles that emerged across all the traditions pointed toward something coherent, something that could be studied and taught and shared. That principle was this: the Force binds all life together, and those who learn to commune with it have a responsibility to use that communion in service of others, not domination of them. There was nothing revolutionary in those words on their own, I suppose, but the commitment beneath them was absolutely revolutionary. Because what they were agreeing to do was to stop being isolated mystical traditions and become a covenant, a binding agreement, rooted in principle rather than personality, that would persist beyond any individual teacher or master. On Tithon, where the great temples stood and where Force-sensitive communities had gathered for centuries, a similar conversation was reaching a similar conclusion, and the two great centers of light-side learning began a deliberate process of communication that would reshape the galaxy's future. I find myself thinking about what that must have felt like, not the triumph of it, which I think would come later, but the peculiar quietness of finding people who understood, after centuries of isolation, that you had been speaking a language they also knew. There was no great ceremony, I think, that came much later when institutions formalized what they were building. Instead, there were slow journeys between worlds. There were lengthy conversations in libraries and temples. There were scholars comparing ancient texts and finding that prophecies recorded independently on different planets spoke of the same future, the same transformative figure who would bring balance. The covenant, when it took shape, was a simple agreement that Force-sensitive communities would pool their knowledge, that they would commit to the principle that communion with the Force created an obligation toward others rather than dominion over them, that they would defend each other against dark side practitioners who had not abandoned the path of domination, and that they would do this not through conquest or forced unity, but through shared conviction and voluntary association. It was, in other words, everything the Rakata Empire had not been. Where the Rakata had imposed uniformity through chains and fear, the Covenant proposed unity through choice and principle. Where the Rakata had extracted resources and energy, the Covenant would work to distribute knowledge and create stability. Where the Rakata had built monuments to the power of their masters, the Covenant would eventually build institutions focused on service. I think there's something worth sitting with in that contrast. The galaxy had seen what absolute power looked like when seized through force and weaponized through fear, and it had watched that power collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. What replaced it was not the reverse tyranny, not the powerless rising up to dominate their former masters, but an intentional choice to build something structured around restraint and shared responsibility. Not all Force users agreed to the Covenant, of course. Some dark side practitioners viewed the agreement as weakness, and they were not entirely wrong. The Covenant would never be as ruthlessly efficient at conquest as a Sith Empire could be. But there was something the dark side practitioners fundamentally misunderstood, and it would become clear only over time. Systems built on choice and shared principle are slower to centralize, slower to mobilize, slower to respond. But they are far more difficult to shatter from within because they have no single point of failure, no master whose death cascades outward and collapses everything. The Covenant was, in essence, an agreement to be decentralized, to remain rooted in multiple worlds and multiple traditions, unified by principle rather than hierarchy. It was, in other words, the exact opposite of what had made the Rakatan Infinite Empire so efficient and so fragile. Verin and the other founders of the Covenant would not live to see the Jedi Order formally established, not by centuries, but what they had started, this commitment to federated communities of Force users bound by written principles rather than enslaved to personality or power. That was the structure that would eventually hold the galaxy's light for thousands of years. There's something both humble and profound in that. The most enduring institutions are often built not by visionaries who command others to follow their vision, but by people who recognized something true and asked others to help protect it, even if that meant sharing authority, diffusing power, and accepting that no single person would ever receive credit for the whole. The Covenant of Light was foundational to everything the Jedi Order would become, even if most of what came later would not remember that it had a name, a moment of agreement, people who sat around tables and asked each other, "What do we actually believe?" It was the moment the scattered fragments decided to remain fragments, but fragments that spoke to each other, fragments that had made promises to each other, fragments that had realized that their strength lay not in unity of command, but in unity of purpose. In the year 2000, before the Jedi Order was formally founded, on the planet Tithon, a world so alive with the Force that its very soil seemed to hum with presence, a group of scattered communities made a quiet decision that would echo through millennia. They had spent centuries gathering, debating, learning from each other's traditions after the Rakata collapse had left the galaxy fractured and silent, and they had come to understand something essential. That knowledge, if it was to survive, needed a home. Not a fortress, as the Sith had built on Korriban, not a monument to power or a machine that fed on subjugation, but something quieter, more patient, a place where what they had learned could be preserved and taught to those who came after. They chose Tithon because the Force there was unmistakable. You could feel it in the very ground beneath your feet, a constant, gentle presence that made meditation easier and teaching clearer, as though the planet itself wanted to help you remember what you had forgotten about yourself. The first temple was not elaborate by the standards of great galactic architecture, though it was precisely planned. The architects, some of whom had studied under the Celestials' remaining monuments, understood that a building could either impose itself upon a place or whisper with it. They chose to whisper. The temple was built into the landscape rather than above it, its walls following the contours of stone that had been carved by wind and water over eons. its courtyards positioned so that morning light would fall in a certain way, its chambers situated so that the force seemed to pool and settle there naturally. There was a hall for meditation, kept simple and open, where the ever-changing play of light across stone could remind a student of the impermanence of all things. There was a library, because the scholars among them, those who had spent decades collecting prophecies and philosophies from across the stars, understood that knowledge written down could survive beyond the lifetime of any single person. There were chambers for teaching, arranged in a spiral so that as students progressed in their understanding, they moved physically through space, a subtle reminder that growth was not a destination, but a path. And at the temple's heart, visible from many of the other chambers, but not from all, was a meditation space open to the sky, where light and shadow mingled in constant conversation. I think there's something important in the choice they made to build gradually rather than all at once, to create a space that could grow as their understanding grew, to resist the impulse toward grand completion that had characterized so many of the structures that had come before. The Celestials had built eternally, the Rakata had built to dominate, the Sith had carved their monuments into the very bedrock of their world as declarations of permanence. The temple on Tithon was built with the assumption that it would need to change, that wisdom accrued over time would demand new spaces, that those who came after would need rooms the founders had not yet imagined. They established, for the first time, something genuinely new, not a unified order under a single leader that had been tried, and it had always curdled into tyranny, but a community bound by shared principles rather than shared blood or shared fear. Teachers came from the Ossus archives, bringing their libraries with them, understanding that they were not surrendering their traditions, but weaving them into something larger. Healers arrived from other worlds, those who had spent centuries learning to sense pain and illness in the Force, teaching that healing required compassion and understanding, not domination. Philosophers who had debated for decades on Tithon itself decided to stay, to formalize their insights into lessons that could be transmitted, recognizing that the work of understanding the Force was never finished, but could at least be organized, passed on, built upon. There was something profound in watching these scattered communities consciously choose to pool their knowledge, not in the way an empire hoards treasure, but in the way a family gathers to share a meal, each contribution remaining recognizable while becoming part of something nourishing to all. The early structure of the temple reflected this commitment. It had teachers, but no single supreme ruler, councils that debated but worked to consensus, a hierarchy of understanding rather than of power. A student who entered the temple was not entering to serve some distant authority, but to join a conversation that had been happening for centuries and would continue long after they were gone. And I find myself thinking about this a lot, because there's something almost unbearably gentle about this choice, to build a place of learning rather than a seat of power, to establish principles rather than impose them, to create a sanctuary for the careful study of something as vast and dangerous as the Force. They had seen what happened when the Force was studied in isolation, or when it was seized as a weapon, or when entire civilizations were reshaped by those who believed they understood it. They had witnessed the collapse of empires and the suffering of enslaved peoples, and the endless cycles of violence between those who wielded power and those who resisted it. And their response was not to build higher walls or sharper weapons, but to create a space, quiet, open, deliberate, where people could learn to listen to each other and to the Force in equal measure. The very fact that this temple was built on a foundation of prophecy, the shared visions of balance that had come to seers across the galaxy, gave the place a kind of temporal depth that earlier structures had lacked. The Celestials had imposed their will, the Rakata had conquered, but those who built this temple on Tithon were acting in response to something they believed had been written into existence itself, the whisper of balance that had called them together. Students who entered the temple were told about these visions, taught that their study was not abstract, but part of something much larger, that they were heirs to a prophecy of transformation that had been waiting, patient, for the right moment to crystallize into action. In 2,000 years, before the Jedi Order would be formally established across the Republic, before councils and codes and formal hierarchies would be written down, this first temple stood as a kind of proof of concept, a demonstration that scattered, diverse communities bound by shared principle could create something more durable, more wise, more resilient than any individual tradition had been alone. It was not perfect. There were debates and disagreements and moments when the commitment to consensus felt exhausting to those who simply wanted to act. But it held, and it grew, and it became a refuge, a place where the Force could be studied without fear of domination, where knowledge could accumulate without calcifying into dogma, where the next generation could arrive and ask their own questions and add their own insights to the conversation. The temple on Tithon became, in that quiet way things sometimes do, the template for everything that would follow. Not because anyone consciously designed it that way, but because it answered a question the galaxy had been asking for thousands of years. What does it look like when power is shared? What kind of structure holds when it is built on service rather than domination, on listening rather than commanding, on the belief that everyone who enters carries wisdom that the whole community needs? Those early teachers would not have known the name, Jedi Order, that would eventually describe what they were building. They were not laying down the path so much as discovering it with each step, each generation adding to the conversation. And perhaps that's what made it endure, what made this quiet monastery on Tithon become not just a beginning, but a blueprint. The fact that it was built with the assumption that it would be changed by those who came after. That wisdom was not something you preserved in amber, but something you tended like a garden, removing what had withered, nurturing what was beginning to grow. By 1500 years before the Jedi Order would formally exist, something had shifted in the scattered, force-using communities across the galaxy. They had stopped trying to describe what they experienced and begun instead to ask what it meant to live well with that experience. On Tithon, in the great monastery that had grown quietly into the landscape like a living thing, the councils that had debated for generations finally arrived at something that felt like consensus. Not agreement, understand, but a kind of settled recognition that certain things kept proving themselves true. A healer from the coastal temples would bring a student to the question: if the Force connects all living things, and you sense that connection, what follows from that? The student, if they were thoughtful, would eventually arrive at the answer the healers had always known: that hurting another was, in some real sense, hurting yourself. This was not mysticism, or rather, it was mysticism grounded in something immediately verifiable, something you could test in your own body, your own breath, your own deepest sense of what was true. It took no faith to experience it, only attention. Elsewhere, the scholars in the great libraries had been collecting accounts of how force-sensitive individuals lived across cultures utterly separate from one another, communities that had never spoken, separated by light years and centuries, yet describing nearly identical principles. A teacher on one world spoke of compassion as the foundation of all mastery. A healer on another, knowing nothing of that teaching, had written the same words into her practice. A philosopher who had spent years in meditation on a third world arrived at the conviction that all beings carried light within them, that this light was the Force itself becoming aware of itself, and that to serve that awareness was the highest possible human purpose. These were not revelations cascading down from some central authority. There was no authority yet, no hierarchy demanding conformity. Rather, they were patterns that emerged when you simply looked at the evidence, when you gathered enough voices together and asked them what they had learned. I find myself thinking about the significance of that a great deal. There's something almost humble about it, the way truth seems to organize itself when you stop trying to impose it and simply observe what the most serious practitioners keep discovering. The covenant of light, that binding agreement among scattered traditions, had created the conditions for this crystallization to happen. But what actually formed was something more subtle than a set of laws. It was a growing recognition of principles that seemed to work. They called them teachings, though teaching is perhaps too formal a word for what was happening. It was more like communities recognizing what they had already learned, naming it clearly, and then finding that the naming made the learning portable, teachable, capable of being passed to a student who had never lived through the discovering of it. Compassion was not presented as a virtue to aspire to, an ideal that lived somewhere above ordinary life. It was taught as the basic architecture of reality, the way the Force actually organized itself, and therefore the only sustainable way to move through the world. A student who rejected compassion was not sinning against the teachings. They were, quite simply, working against the fundamental structure of existence, and suffering was the inevitable consequence. Peace, similarly, was not understood as the absence of conflict, but as something more active, more grounded. The recognition that conflict arose from the illusion of separation, from the fear that came when you forgot you were connected to everything you fought against. Knowledge was not presented as power over others, but as understanding, the patient accumulation of insight into how things actually worked, insight that naturally led to more skillful action, to better choices, to lives that generated less harm. And service. This was perhaps the most carefully articulated of all the teachings. Service was not self-abnegation or the denial of one's own needs, but rather the alignment of one's actions with the actual structure of the universe, the understanding that your own flourishing was intimately bound up with everyone else's. When you served, you were not sacrificing yourself for others in some grim, depleting sense. You were recognizing that there was no meaningful separation between yourself and others to begin with, and therefore serving them was the most direct path to serving yourself. The Sith, watching from Korriban and from the shadowed spaces where their power still held, seemed to understand these teachings mainly as weaknesses, principles that would make the light side communities vulnerable, that would prevent them from seizing power with the single-minded ruthlessness required to actually hold it. But the light side teachers, by this point, had watched enough cycles of history to recognize what the Sith seemed to have never learned. That power seized through domination was inherently unstable, that it required constant defense against internal collapse, that it generated enemies faster than it could suppress them. The infinite empire of the Rakata had been the clearest possible demonstration of this principle. Domination was efficient, certainly, but only in the short term. It was a solution that contained its own dissolution. By contrast, communities built on shared principle, on compassion, on the alignment of individual will with the larger structure of existence, seemed to generate their own endurance. They could adapt, because they were not defending a fixed power structure, but rather a flexible set of principles that could be applied in new ways. They could heal, because they had built into themselves the understanding that harm was interconnection of a kind too, and that healing was always possible through a return to right relation. The teachings that crystallized during these 1,000 years before the formal order would be recognizable in the Jedi Code centuries later. There is no emotion, there is peace. A teaching that had grown from the observation that destructive emotions arose from the illusion of separation and were dissolved when connection was truly felt. There is no ignorance, there is knowledge, recognition that the seeking and finding of truth was the highest activity of consciousness. There is no passion, there is serenity, an understanding that the deepest peace came not from denying the intensity of felt experience, but from moving through it with equanimity, from honoring what you felt without letting it override what you knew to be true. These were not rules imposed from above. They were frameworks for recognizing what was actually happening when people lived according to principles and observed the results. In the temples and monasteries and gathering places across the galaxy, teachers began committing these teachings to writing, creating the first formal texts, the first codified understanding of what it meant to live in alignment with the light side of the Force. They wrote carefully, trying to capture not just the content of the teaching, but the lived experience of it, the way understanding shifted when you actually practiced it. A student reading such a text centuries later might receive it intellectually, but the text itself was trying to point toward something that only direct experience could fully convey. By the end of this era, something remarkable had stabilized. A set of shared understandings had emerged from thousands of years of scattered experiment and observation, and these understandings were no longer merely the property of individual traditions or isolated communities. They had become common knowledge among the light side force users across known space, transmitted through pilgrims and scholars, written down in books that were copied and recopied, debated and refined, and tested against the lived experience of hundreds of communities. The philosophy was not complete. It would continue to evolve and deepen, but it was coherent enough now to be taught, to be preserved, to be passed forward. And in that codification and preservation lay the possibility that one day, when the scattered traditions finally unified formally, they would not have to rediscover these truths from the beginning, but could stand on the shoulders of 1,500 years of careful thinking. The teachings that would eventually define the Jedi Order had already been formulated, proven, and woven deep into the consciousness of everyone who carried the light side of the Force in their body and their will. All that remained was the final gathering, the formal articulation, the moment when scattered wisdom would become one unified order. But that was still far enough in the future to be beyond the horizon of even the wisest among them. 1,000 years before the Jedi Order would take its formal name, 7 Force users gathered on Tithon in a chamber whose walls had grown smooth and warm from the presence of countless seekers before them. They came from different worlds, different traditions, different philosophies. A healer from the singing communes of Ambria, a scholar from the great libraries of Ossus, a warrior teacher whose lineage traced back to the earliest defenders against the Sith, and 4 others whose names, by the time the Order was officially established, had become almost mythological. What brought them together was not sudden inspiration, but decades of quiet recognition that the scattered traditions across the galaxy, though speaking different languages and practicing different disciplines, were pointing toward the same truth. The healer could sense it in the bodies she touched. The scholar could trace it in the oldest texts. The warrior could feel it in the discipline that held her hand steady when it would have been easy to kill. They had each, independently, arrived at the conviction that the Force was not something to seize or command, but something to listen for, to align with, to serve. I find myself thinking about what that conversation must have been like. Not dramatic, not triumphant, but patient, almost tentative. One of them would speak, and the others would recognize in their words something they had always known, but never had the language to say. There must have been moments of disagreement, genuine intellectual disagreement, about whether compassion was primary or whether knowledge was, about whether service meant self-effacement or self-cultivation. But underneath the debate was a shared recognition that these were not opposing truths but facets of a single reality, and that trying to understand that reality together made each of them stronger, wiser, more attuned to what they were attempting to serve. Over months, perhaps years, they began to codify what they had learned, that the Force connected all living things, that this connection created obligation, that the cultivation of the self was inseparable from service to others. They wrote these principles down not as commandments, but as observations, descriptions of what they had actually experienced, what thousands of practitioners across the galaxy had learned through practice. When a student learned compassion deeply enough, they became more attuned to the Force, not less. When a teacher released the desire to dominate, their influence expanded. When a seeker stopped treating knowledge as power to be hoarded and started treating it as something to be shared, understanding deepened. These were not metaphors. They were mechanically true in how the Force actually worked. One of the 7, there are accounts that it was a woman from the oldest Tithon lineages, proposed something that must have seemed almost reckless at the time. What if they wrote down everything they had disagreed about, alongside everything they had agreed on? What if the order they were founding carried within it the seeds of its own self-questioning. There's a kind of confidence in that decision that takes my breath away. Most organizations protect themselves by enforcing orthodoxy, by creating a single correct interpretation and punishing deviation. The 7 founding masters chose the opposite. They built questioning into the structure itself. They created space for what they called the perpetual dialogue, the idea that every generation would need to re-examine the teachings, test them against lived experience, and be willing to evolve understanding without abandoning principle. This was radical. It was also, I think, why the order endured so long. They established councils not as hierarchies of decree, but as forums for genuine deliberation, places where younger students could challenge the interpretations of the ancient ones, where experience from the edges could reshape thinking at the center. They committed to decentralization, to the idea that the force was so large and varied that no single temple, no single tradition could grasp it whole. Knowledge belonged in many places, held by many teachers, practiced in many ways. If one monastery fell, another would remember. If one interpretation failed the test of practice, another tradition would have preserved alternatives. And perhaps most crucially, they made an explicit covenant. The order would exist to serve the galaxy, not to rule it. Force users would be advisors, healers, peacekeepers, teachers, but never masters of empires, never tyrants, never the kind of power that consumed and diminished everything around it. This sounds obvious in retrospect, but it was not. The memory of the Rakatan Infinite Empire was still fresh in the galaxy's consciousness. The Sith remained a presence, a continuing threat, still believing that power was something to seize rather than serve. The temptation to meet force with force, to build an order powerful enough to dominate the dark side out of existence, must have been profound. The 7 founding masters rejected that path. There is something almost unbearably moving about that choice, made 1,000 years before the events that would test it most terribly. They looked at the machinery of domination, the Star Forge, the enslaved worlds, the empires built on hierarchy and fear, and they said no. We will not do this. We will do something far more difficult. We will trust that if we align ourselves with how the Force actually works, if we embody compassion and knowledge and service, we will be strong enough to endure, and that will be enough. The names of the 7 have been mostly lost to the vast span of years between that gathering and the Order's eventual official establishment. What remains is the shape of their thinking, embedded in every teaching the Jedi Order would go on to espouse, in every principle about balance and service, in every council chamber built to listen rather than command. When you study the earliest texts, you can hear their voices in the choices they made, patient, thoughtful, secure enough in their own understanding to leave room for future wisdom they could not yet imagine. They did not establish a dogma. They established a conversation. And then they stepped back, knowing that the strength of what they had created would be measured not by how long the order lasted, but by whether it could remain open to transformation while holding fast to principle, a balance so difficult to maintain that it would test the order for centuries to come. But that is a story for later chapters. For now, it is enough to know that on Tithon, in that warm chamber, 7 teachers looked at each other with recognition and relief and said, yes, we understand differently, and we can move forward together. That was the true founding, quieter and more profound than any official ceremony would ever be. It was the moment the Jedi Order was born. They spread quietly at first, like light through a prism, each community sending ambassadors out from Tithon and Ossus to worlds that had begun asking, who are these people who teach that the Force connects all living things? The Republic, as it was crystallizing then, still young, still finding its shape, needed something the Force users offered without quite knowing they needed it. A language for justice that didn't require conquest, a framework for peace that honored the autonomy of individual worlds. A senator from a disputed border colony would request a teacher, and within a season someone would arrive, not to settle the dispute by force, but to help both sides recognize what they actually agreed upon beneath the noise of their argument. I think about what that must have felt like, to have spent generations fragmented and uncertain, and then to discover that what you'd been quietly discovering was exactly what the galaxy was quietly asking for. They didn't arrive announcing themselves as saviors or claiming authority over anything. They came as listeners, as people who understood that wisdom existed in every tradition, and that their role was to help communities remember what they already knew. On Coruscant, which was becoming the Republic's center, a world of towers and light, and the constant motion of a billion species intersecting, the Jedi were welcomed into advisory positions, not as rulers but as counselors, people you consulted when a decision needed to be made from a place of genuine principle rather than pressure. The chancellors and senators discovered something useful. When you asked a Jedi what they thought a difficult choice meant, they didn't answer quickly, and they didn't frame things as winning and losing, which was how most political calculation worked. They would sit with the problem and then say something like, "What would serve the largest possible number of people, and how can we honor the ones this decision hurts?" It was not a way of thinking the Republic had inherited, and it changed things slowly. The Order's structure was deliberately loose in those early centuries, federated rather than hierarchical, each community maintaining its own traditions while sharing a core commitment to study, service, and resistance to domination. This was something the Seven Masters had deliberately built into their vision, not a pyramid with authority at the apex, but a network where each node strengthened the others, where a teacher on a distant world had as much voice as anyone in the central temples. It meant disagreement was constant, even expected, because they had agreed that the moment the Order stopped questioning itself, it would begin to fossilize into something brittle. The dark side practitioners watched this expansion with something between curiosity and contempt, and then, I think, something closer to confusion, because the Jedi Order was growing not through conquest or clever manipulation, but simply because worlds kept asking for their teachers, and the teachers kept going. You could trace the spread on a map. Tithon and Ossus remained centers of study, but temples rose on Dantooine, where old Rakatan ruins held forgotten knowledge waiting to be recontextualized. On Ashla, a world that had suffered terribly under Rakatan occupation and now needed reminding that healing was possible. On Hosnian Prime, where merchants and scholars kept the greatest libraries in the Republic and wanted teachers to help them understand what knowledge was for. In every case, the Jedi didn't impose a single way of being, but brought a commitment to asking the right questions. Not "how do I win?" but "how do I serve?" Not "how do I protect myself?" but "how do I recognize the other person's humanity?" These seem like small shifts in framing, and I suppose they are, but small shifts applied consistently across a galaxy create the shape of ages to come. Some communities rejected the Jedi entirely, of course, cultures that distrusted centralized authority or had found their own paths and wanted no new teachers, and the Order accepted this without resentment, understanding that part of their principle was accepting refusal. What surprised them, I think, was how much they were needed not for their power, although their ability to mediate conflicts through force sensitivity was undeniable, but for their willingness to hold complexity without collapsing it into simplicity. A Jedi would enter a village torn by ancient feuds and wouldn't pick a side. Instead, they'd help both sides see that their enemy was facing the same scarcity, the same fear that had made them enemies in the first place. This was not magic, though people sometimes experienced it as such. It was simply the practice of compassion applied methodically, with intention, by someone trained to see past surface conflict to the structures underneath. The Jedi Order became, in those centuries, what the Republic didn't have but desperately needed. An institution dedicated entirely to asking what was true rather than what was profitable. An organization that measured success not in power accumulated, but in peace maintained, in knowledge preserved, in cruelty resisted. And because they did this openly, without claiming monopoly on rightness, other traditions began to respect them, not to worship them, but to recognize them as trustworthy in a galaxy where trust had been historically fragile. I find myself thinking about what it means that the Order's greatest strength in those centuries was also a kind of vulnerability. They'd committed themselves to service, which meant they could be asked for anything, and their principle said yes to genuine requests, which meant they had less energy for their own survival than an empire would. There's something almost heartbreaking in that, a movement so committed to being useful to others that it becomes dependent on those others recognizing that usefulness and protecting it. But that's also what happened. The Republic began to see the Jedi Order not as a resource to exploit, but as something precious that needed protecting, almost the way you protect something that reminds you of your best self. By the time we reach the end of this era, 500 years before the formal establishment of the Order as we've come to understand it, the Force users who had once been scattered, uncertain, isolated on their separate worlds, had become woven into the fabric of the Republic's thinking. It wasn't that they controlled anything. It was that they'd become part of what people consulted when they wanted to know what the right thing was, and in a galaxy full of competing interests and pressures, that quiet influence mattered more than any throne. The Order had learned something the Sith never quite grasped, that the kind of power that lasts is the kind that doesn't demand recognition, that strength looks like helping others stand rather than insisting they bow. And somewhere in that understanding, they'd become something stable enough, something true enough, to endure whatever would come next. A keeper is someone who tends something, a garden, a library, a principle. And I think that's the word we need to understand what happened on Tithon 100 years before the Order would formally exist. The Jedi communities had grown large by then, spread across the planet and into its twin moons, and they had built something genuinely beautiful. Schools where light side and dark side practitioners studied together. Temples where the balance between Ashlar and Bogan was seen not as a compromise, but as the truest path forward. But balance, it turns out, is harder to maintain than it sounds. There were always some, on both sides, though it was easier to see in the dark side practitioners, who looked at the shared teachings and decided that what they really meant was permission to take what they wanted. A student of great power, burning with ambition, would study the texts about the Force's infinite potential and hear in them a justification for personal dominion rather than shared growth. The light side teachers would try to redirect this, to help the student understand that power exercised in isolation from compassion becomes something else entirely, something that corrodes itself from within. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from caring deeply about something and watching others use that very thing against its own purpose. And I think that's what the keepers of Tithon began to feel around this time. The elders, those teachers who had lived through the wars, who had seen civilizations collapse under the weight of seized power, began to ask themselves a question that had been hovering beneath all their work. At what point does tolerance of darkness become complicity in it? It's an easier question to ask than to answer. The Jedi philosophy had always held that the darkness was not evil in itself, that it was part of the Force's natural expression, that imbalance toward either extreme was the real danger. But what happens when someone uses the language of balance as a shield while they're quietly consolidating power, gathering followers, teaching a vision of the Force that sound like service, but tastes like domination to anyone paying attention? One teacher, a woman whose name history did not quite preserve but whose influence would echo forward, began documenting what she called the drift. Patterns she observed in how dark side practitioners on Tithon's moon gradually moved from studying difficult emotions as part of a balanced path to celebrating those emotions as the highest expression of will. She recorded conversations, teachings, the slow mutation of what had once been a shared framework into something more tribal, more separated, more concerned with power than with understanding. She was not angry when she did this, and I find that detail meaningful. She was sad and clear and thorough. She showed her work to the council, and the council had to confront something they had been avoiding, that their commitment to balance and tolerance could not remain absolute if the community was going to survive. This sounds small, I know, stated so plainly, but it was the moment everything changed. Because what they were really asking was, is there a line? And if there is, who draws it? And how do you draw a line without becoming the very thing you're trying to prevent? The dark side communities on the Bogan Moon, and there were genuine practitioners there, serious students of difficult power, began to feel the shift in the parent community's posture. It was subtle, not yet a rejection, but it was a withdrawing of the previous unconditional welcome. Some of them understood it and worked harder to demonstrate that power could be studied with discipline and compassion held together. Others felt it as betrayal, as the light side majority imposing its values and rewriting the agreement they all had made centuries before. The keepers, those who tended the schools and the libraries and the principals, began meeting separately to wrestle with this, and the conversations were not easy. There were those who argued for a harder line. Dark side practitioners who were visibly drifting toward domination should be removed, exiled, prevented from teaching. There were others who insisted this was precisely the kind of fear-driven action that had collapsed the Sith empires, that the moment they began choosing separation and control, they would have lost the very thing that made them different from the tyrannies they had witnessed. What emerged slowly from these conversations was not a resolution, but an articulation. The keepers began to teach that there was indeed a difference between studying power and being consumed by hunger for it, between acknowledging difficult emotions and being ruled by them. They began to distinguish, more carefully than they had before, between self-defense and conquest, between maintaining a community's integrity and imposing uniformity by force. They said, we can study the dark side and remain light side practitioners if we're honest about what we're doing and why, if we maintain compassion as the foundation, if we're willing to be changed by what we learn rather than using what we learn to justify what we already wanted. But they also said, there is a point at which someone has chosen a path away from us, and we have to be willing to name that. And perhaps most importantly, they said, we don't have the right to force anyone toward the light, but we have the responsibility to not enable domination under the guise of tolerance. It is a genuinely difficult balance to articulate, and I think the reason the Jedi eventually evolved into the Jedi Order was not because they failed at this balance, but because maintaining it required more institutional wisdom than any community could sustain indefinitely without formal structure and deliberate transmission. On Tithon, the keepers began to prepare for that. They started writing more carefully, codifying not just what they believed, but how they arrived at these beliefs, documenting the conversations, the disagreements, the reasoning. They began to ask, what do we need to pass on so that the next generation doesn't have to rediscover this the hard way? And in asking that, they began the work that would, within a century, become the Jedi Order itself. There's something worth dwelling on here, I think. The order that the galaxy would eventually know was not born from perfect wisdom or clarity, but from the hard experience of trying to hold contradictions together and discovering that you need more than good intentions to do it. It was born from keepers who looked at what they had built and asked themselves what it needed to become to survive its own success. The Force connects all life, and the keepers of Tithon had learned through painful, patient work that connection without principle becomes complicity, that balance without boundaries becomes drift, that service without the courage to say no becomes service to domination. These were not happy lessons, but they were necessary ones, and they are the ground on which everything that follows would be built. The council chambers on Tithon were not grand, and I think that mattered more than anyone realized at the time. They were built from the same stone as the monastery itself, grown from the landscape rather than imposed upon it, with a high ceiling open to the sky so that the moons, Ashlar and Bogan, the light and the shadow, could be seen turning overhead. 12 chairs were arranged not in a hierarchy, but in a circle, though the builders understood that even a circle implies a kind of hierarchy if you look at it long enough. The 7 masters who had gathered 1,000 years before had become more, their students had become teachers, their teachings had spread across worlds, and now the time had come to ask, what structure could hold all of this without breaking it? What does an order look like when it is built on principles rather than power? The first truly formal council assembled on a morning when Ashlar was bright and Bogan was dark, as they always were, the moons turning in their ancient rhythm, indifferent to the decisions being made below. The keepers had spent years documenting the drift, recording where compassion had curdled into complicity, where study had become hunger, where connection without principle had allowed domination to take root. Now they gathered, teachers from Ossus, from Tithon, from the scattered temple communities that had grown across the Republic, to ask, how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we create something that can survive its own success without becoming what we fled from? The discussions were not bitter, and I find myself thinking about that a lot. There was no sense of recrimination, no feeling that anyone had failed. Instead, there was a kind of exhausted wisdom, the hard-won knowledge that comes from watching something you love develop symptoms you recognize. They had all seen what power looks like when it settles into a community unchecked. They had all felt the seduction of certainty, the comfort of believing that your way is the way, that your understanding is complete. One teacher from Ossus, whose name the records do not preserve, though her voice shaped the conversation, insisted that the order would need binding rules, not to constrain, but to clarify. Rules, she argued, are promises you make to yourself about who you will be even when you are tired or frightened or certain you are right. Another master, a scholar who had spent decades in the libraries of Tithon, suggested that no single person should hold all power, that decisions should require a council, that disagreement should be built into the structure itself rather than treated as failure. There's something in that thought that still moves me, the recognition that if you cannot disagree with each other and remain bound together, your unity is false. A warrior teacher whose students had already begun traveling beyond the Republic's borders spoke of service, of the commitment that the Order would never serve itself, but always the galaxy it inhabited. Service, she said, is the only antidote to the slow drift toward domination, because a community dedicated to service can never convince itself that power seized is power justified. By the time the conversations reached consensus, and they did reach consensus, though the process was neither quick nor comfortable, the shape of the council had crystallized. 12 members rotating, each responsible for different aspects of the Order's work. Training, knowledge, service, wisdom, and so on, structured so that no single person could accumulate unchecked authority. There would be a leader. The tradition called for someone of exceptional wisdom and restraint. But that person would be bound by the council, would be able to be questioned and even removed if the Order determined they had drifted. This was radical, I think, though they would not have called it that. Across the galaxy, power consolidated. Empires grew through seizing and holding. The light-side traditions had watched this cycle for millennia, had seen the Rakata build their infinite empire on certainty and hierarchy and enslaved labor, had watched that empire collapse under the weight of its own internal rot. Now they were saying, we will try something different. We will build something that assumes we are wrong, that distributes power so that any single wrongness cannot consume everything. We will create rules not to control people, but to remind ourselves of our commitments when we are tempted away from them. The first formal High Council was sworn on Tithon, with the moons as witness. A beautiful moment, I imagine, though the records describe it simply. No one knew that they were establishing something that would endure for 10,000 years, that would weather civil wars and schisms, and the slow erosion of principle that nearly destroyed it. No one knew that 50 years from now, the structure they were creating would transform, would move from Tithon to Coruscant, would become more formal and more hierarchical than even they might have wished, in the way of all institutions that must serve something larger than themselves. What they knew was this, that they had learned something from watching the galaxy, that principles matter more than power, that unity built on shared conviction lasts longer than unity imposed through domination, and that the best way to prevent drift is to write down your promises, to speak them aloud, to bind yourself to them with others as witness. The council chambers remained open to the sky. Ashler and Bogan continued their turn above, light and shadow, neither conquered, neither supreme, both necessary to the balance. And below them, 12 people sat in a circle and decided that their order would try to embody that same balance, not dominating one principle at the expense of another, but learning to hold multiple truths without collapse. It was not perfect. No human structure ever is. But it was built on something real, on the hard-won wisdom of thousands of years of watching what works and what doesn't, on the recognition that the best power is the power you are willing to constrain, and on a commitment so fundamental that they were willing to bind themselves to it formally, in the presence of each other, with nothing but principle and mutual obligation to enforce it. It is difficult to say when exactly a gathering of people becomes an institution, when shared principles, hardened by generations of practice, transform into something that can be formally named and said to exist. Perhaps it happens the moment someone says the words aloud, and others recognize themselves in them and nod. Perhaps it is slower than that, a gradual sedimentation where the informal becomes habitual, and the habitual becomes structural, until one day you look around and realize that what once required constant conversation now requires only quiet agreement. What we know is that on Tithon, in the temples and learning centers that had grown over centuries from small gathering places into substantial, living institutions, the Force users and their students, now scattered across the Republic to serve as advisors and mediators and guardians, recognized that they had become something that needed a name. They called it the Jedi Order. It is not a grand moment when you say it. The chronicles from that time suggest it was quiet, almost mundane, the way important things often are when they are real rather than performed. What made it real was not a coronation or a proclamation, but the simple fact that across dozens of worlds, when travelers asked who these people were and what they served, the answer had become consistent. We are Jedi. We serve the light. We are bound to each other by principles older than any single tradition. The Republic, in its early configurations, was still learning what it meant to hold together a galaxy no longer dominated by a single tyrannical force. The Rakata were gone. The celestial monuments were ruins. The scattering of dark side practitioners who had once threatened to overwhelm the light side traditions were now fragmented, fewer, and often focused on their own survival or consolidation rather than galactic conquest. Into this relative opening moved the Jedi, not as conquerors, but as the thing the Republic realized it desperately needed. People committed to principle rather than power, people who had studied the nature of suffering and learned its antidotes, people who could advise without demanding authority and protect without seeking dominion. I think about what that must have felt like, for worlds that had lived under the weight of dread empires to suddenly encounter beings who refused to rule them. The Jedi arrived with open hands. They offered knowledge freely, served without payment, and when asked to help mediate a dispute or heal a wounded person or teach young people the discipline of understanding themselves through the Force, they said yes, not because they were commanded to, but because service to the galaxy's well-being had become inseparable from their understanding of what it meant to be Jedi at all. The Republic began to trust them, not overnight, but with the slow, cautious certainty that comes from repeated kindness, without expectation of return. On Coruscant, the political heart of the emerging galactic government, the Republic created a formal place for a Jedi presence, not as rulers, but as advisors and defenders of the principles that the Republic itself claimed to be founded upon: justice, peace, the sanctity of individual life, resistance to tyranny. The Jedi accepted, understanding that this was not a seduction or consolidation of power, but a responsibility they had been slowly preparing for across millennia. Within a century of formal establishment, the Jedi Order had woven itself into the Republic's structure with such deliberate gentleness that most people did not quite realize it had happened. There is something almost miraculous in that, if you think about it carefully. An institution born not from seized power, but from requested service, spreading across the galaxy not through conquest, but through communities asking for their presence to remain, their guidance to deepen, their principles to serve as a compass when confusion arose. And yet, embedded in this very gentleness lay something that the Jedi themselves did not yet fully understand, or perhaps did understand, and chose to trust anyway. By deliberately refusing to rule, they had made themselves dependent on the galaxy's continued willingness to protect what protects them. They had built their structure on decentralization and service precisely because they believed those choices aligned with how reality actually worked, how the Force actually moved, how lasting strength was actually built. But belief and reality are sometimes companions, and sometimes they part ways. The Jedi High Council, now formally established on Coruscant in a great temple that would one day become the Order's heart, was bound by its own deliberately written principles, rules that prevented the consolidation of unchecked power, that mandated decentralization, that enshrined the idea that disagreement and questioning made the institution stronger, not weaker. In the centuries to come, those rules would save the Order many times over. They would also, eventually, prove tragic in ways that no one in this moment could have anticipated. But that is the peculiar burden of principles. They do not protect you from the unintended consequences of living them faithfully. For now, though, in this moment, when the Jedi Order has just become formally, publicly, institutionally real, when the Republic has recognized them and worlds have begun to request their presence and ask their counsel, what strikes me most is the profound quietness of it all. There are no grand ceremonies in the records, no proclamations written in letters of light across the sky. What exists instead is thousands of small moments. A Jedi Master teaching a young student how to listen to the Force through patient, gentle repetition. An advisor suggesting to a planetary council that a dispute might yield to compassion rather than coercion. A healer arriving on a world ravaged by plague and staying until the last person either recovered or found peace in their passing. A scholar in the great temple on Coruscant carefully copying the foundational principles of the Order into a new volume, knowing that these words would outlast them, would outlast everyone in the building, would become the quiet framework within which countless lives would eventually unfold. The Jedi Order has been born not with fanfare, but with commitment, not through the seizure of power, but through the acceptance of responsibility, not as an ending of the journey toward understanding the Force, but as a formal recognition that the journey had become a shared one and would remain so for ages to come. The galaxy did not know it yet, but it had just been given its greatest protection and its greatest vulnerability. The thing that would save it, and eventually, after many long centuries, the thing that would require saving.